When Donald Trump mocked Michelle Obama on national television, he thought it was just another headline. What followed was an $800 million reckoning that shook the presidency and reminded America that even power has limits. It happened on a Tuesday night during what was supposed to be a calm town hall. Broadcast from Dallas, the audience had settled in. The cameras were rolling, and the air carried that tense stillness that always comes before something unpredictable. President Donald Trump sat beneath the bright lights answering questions from a mix of supporters and skeptics. Then came a question from a teacher in the front row, one that seemed harmless at first. She asked about civility and leadership and whether he believed respect still had a place in modern politics. Trump smirked, leaned back in his chair, and said words that would shake the country before the hour ended. Civility, you should ask Michelle Obama about that. He snapped, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He went further too far. He mocked her voice, her looks, even her education, turning what should have been a political answer into a personal insult that made the live audience gasp. The room froze for a beat. The moderator tried to regain control, but Trump kept going. He laughed at his own remark, tossing out another jab, as if he were performing for a crowd rather than leading a nation. Some people in the audience laughed nervously. Others stood up and left at that exact moment in a quiet living room in Martha's Vineyard. Barack Obama sat watching with his wife. The light from the television cast a soft glow over the room. Michelle's hands were clasped tightly together on her lap. Her eyes didn't leave the screen, but her expression said everything. Barack reached for the remote and muted the TV. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Did he really just say that? She whispered. He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Yes, he did that night." Social media erupted like wildfire. Hashtags about the insult trended globally within minutes. Commentators argued whether Trump had crossed a moral line or simply spoken his mind. Clips of the moment flooded every platform. Some laughed, others demanded an apology. The White House released no statement by morning. The clip had racked up tens of millions of views. News anchors replayed it over and over, dissecting every word, every facial twitch. It wasn't just another controversy. It was something personal, raw, and deeply public inside the Obama home. The former president's phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Friends, former staffers, journalists, they all wanted to know how he was going to respond. Michelle stayed quiet. She cooked breakfast as usual, but every motion felt deliberate, controlled, like she was keeping herself from shaking. Barack watched her, sensing the storm beneath that calm surface. Later that morning, he stepped outside to take a call from an old ally in Washington. "Barack, I know you don't want to engage him," the voice said, "but this one's different. You can't let this slide." He didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted across the ocean's horizon. The seagulls cried in the distance, the tide pulling back and forth with a rhythm that seemed almost mocking in its calmness. Finally, he said, "It's not about me. It's about her, and about what it means when words like his go unchallenged in Washington." Trump's staff tried to control the firestorm. Advisors scrambled to rewrite talking points, hoping to pivot the conversation toward the economy or foreign policy. But Trump refused to apologize during a quick press gaggle. He doubled down there too. "Sensitive," he said, waving off the reporters. It was a joke. People need to toughen up. That line made headlines all over again. By the next evening, legal experts on CNN, MSNBC, and even Fox were debating whether a sitting president could be sued for defamation. "It's uncharted territory," one commentator said. "If Obama pursues this, it's going to be historic." Barack didn't confirm anything. He didn't deny it either. But late that night, he sat at his desk, staring at a legal pad filled with notes. Michelle joined him quietly, a cup of tea in her hand. "You don't have to do this," she said. He turned the pen in his fingers, eyes still on the page. "No," he replied softly. "I think I do." She took a slow breath and sat beside him. "If you go through with it, make sure it's not just about us. Make it about what's right." He smiled faintly, a sadness in his eyes. "That's the only way I know." How the following morning cameras caught his attorney walking into the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., a thick folder in hand. Reporters shouted questions, flashes exploded, and the words "Obama versus Trump, $800 million defamation lawsuit" began spreading across every major network. It was official. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. But behind those headlines, something bigger was starting to move, a quiet, deliberate force that would soon turn one man's insult into a nationwide reckoning. The morning after the town hall, the sun rose over Washington with a strange stillness. News anchors spoke in urgent tones, their words overlapping as new details surfaced. By the minute, every channel carried one headline: Obama takes legal action against Trump at 9 a.m. outside the U.S. District Court on Constitution Avenue. A crowd gathered behind metal barricades. Reporters, activists, and curious onlookers pressed forward as Barack Obama's lead attorney, Jonathan Reeves, stepped up to the podium. Reeves, a tall man with a calm, precise way of speaking, had represented senators, CEOs, and even journalists, but never a former president against a sitting one. He unfolded a single sheet of paper and began: today, on behalf of my client, President Barack Obama, we are filing a defamation lawsuit against President Donald J. Trump. He said clearly the comments made during Tuesday's live broadcast were false, malicious, and deeply damaging, not only to Michelle Obama's reputation, but to the standard of respect every public servant is owed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "How much are you suing for?" Reeves looked up briefly. $800 million. He replied, "We believe that's a fair measure of the harm caused." The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed, questions fired from every direction. Can a sitting president even be sued? Is this politically motivated? What does the Obamas want out of this? Reeves simply said, "We want accountability, that's all." Then, he turned and walked back toward the courthouse doors. Inside the White House, the news hit like a bomb. According to staff, who later spoke under anonymity, Trump was in the middle of a policy briefing when an aide handed him a printed copy of the headline. His face turned red almost instantly. 800 million, he barked. For what a joke. He slammed the paper down, startling those around him. Advisors exchanged nervous glances. A senior strategist tried to calm him. "Sir, we can fight this. It'll get thrown out. Presidential immunity still holds." Trump jabbed a finger at him. "You make sure of it. I'm not paying a dime to those people." But outside the walls of the West Wing, the mood was shifting. Protesters gathered in Lafayette Square, waving hand-painted signs that read, "Respect Michelle," and "Words have consequences" across the country. High school teachers used the incident as a discussion topic in civics classes. College law professors dissected the constitutional implications. Even late-night hosts, some normally sympathetic to Trump, called his remarks a new low. That evening, Barack Obama appeared briefly before the press at a community center in Baltimore, where he had been scheduled to speak weeks before the controversy began. Cameras followed him as he walked to the podium. No notes in hand, his expression composed. "I didn't plan to be talking about this today," he began. "But sometimes you don't get to choose the moment." The comments made about my wife weren't just cruel. They represented something deeper, a belief that you can tear someone down for sport and still lead with honor. "We've all seen what happens when disrespect becomes normalized. This time I'm choosing not to let it slide." The crowd stood and applauded. Some shouted encouragement. Others cried quietly, moved by how personal his words felt. Michelle wasn't there, but her absence said everything. By the next morning, the internet had divided itself into camps. Trump's supporters called it a witch hunt, while Obama's defenders hailed it as a stand for dignity. News pundits filled every segment with speculation. Could this really go to trial? Would the courts even allow it? Meanwhile, in a quiet corner office of the Obama Foundation in Chicago, Jonathan Reeves and his legal team began building the case. They collected transcripts, video footage, and sworn statements from experts in media ethics. Every sentence Trump had said on that stage was analyzed frame by frame. Reeves told his team, "This isn't about politics. This is about precedent. If we win, it'll redefine accountability for anyone who uses the power of office to smear." Another citizen, the case filings became public that same afternoon. CNN aired the PDF live on screen as the anchor read excerpts aloud. Malicious intent, racial undertones, intentional infliction of emotional distress. The document was long, meticulous, and cutting. Trump responded almost instantly on Truth Social. "Obama is trying to silence free speech. Totally unfair. I said nothing wrong." The post got millions of views in minutes, but legal analysts warned that his online comments could worsen his case. Inside the White House, tension thickened. Staff whispered that the president's temper was flaring. More often, meetings ended abruptly. Phones were slammed down. Even his press secretary seemed shaken during the daily briefing. Reporters began asking one question over and over. Will Trump apologize? He never did. Instead, he called into a conservative talk show that weekend and said they can sue all they want. I've got better lawyers. The host laughed nervously, trying to move the topic along, but the damage was already done. Clips of that call were replayed everywhere. Michelle Obama, meanwhile, stayed silent. She focused on her initiatives, attended a few low-profile events, and never mentioned Trump publicly. But her silence spoke louder than any statement could the world knew. This lawsuit wasn't just about hurt feelings, it was about dignity. By the following Monday, the court had set a preliminary hearing date. Federal marshals confirmed receipt of the summons at the White House. The wheels of justice had started turning, and for the first time in a long while, Trump couldn't control the narrative. But deep inside those West Wing corridors, something was brewing, a mix of anger, fear, and pride that would soon boil over into chaos. By the second week after the lawsuit's announcement, the West Wing felt like a pressure cooker. The atmosphere was heavy-charged and unpredictable. Like everyone was waiting for the next outburst. Staffers avoided making eye contact in hallways. Even the Secret Service detail had learned to walk a little faster when they heard Trump's voice echoing down the corridor inside the Oval Office. It was another long morning of chaos. Stacks of printed news reports covered the desk, most of them marked with red pen. The words, "Obama sues." Trump glared from every front page. Trump was pacing in circles, holding a phone in one hand and a Diet Coke in the other. These networks are lying, he barked, every one of them. They should be the ones sued. A few aides exchanged quiet glances. No one dared interrupt him. But when his communications director, Laura Pierce, finally spoke, her tone was measured. Mr. President, the coverage isn't going away. We need to pivot the message. Something about unfair treatment, free speech, anything that keeps this from looking personal. Trump turned sharply. It is personal. Laura, he made it personal when he went to court. You think I'm going to sit back while Obama drags my name through the MUD? Laura hesitated, then said, Sir, respectfully, your remarks were broadcast. Live people heard them exactly as you said them. We can't undo that. His face hardened, then fix it. That's what you're here for, isn't it? She fell silent. Meanwhile, inside the Roosevelt Room, the legal team huddled with senior advisors. Bill Sanderson, Trump's lead counsel, was going over the potential defenses. We can argue presidential immunity, he said, tapping his pen against the folder, but that only applies to actions within official duties. The problem is, this wasn't an executive decision, it was a personal comment. An aide frowned. So what happens if the court says the lawsuit stands? Sanderson sighed. Then we're in new territory. No president has ever been held personally liable for defamation. While in office, the room went quiet. Phones buzzed in pockets, but no one moved. Trump stormed in without warning. What's the plan, he demanded. Sanderson straightened. We're filing a motion to dismiss, sir. We'll challenge the court's jurisdiction. Trump waved his hand impatiently. No legal mumbo-jumbo, just make it disappear. When he left the room, Sanderson muttered, that's not how it works. The cracks inside his team grew wider by the day. Some advisors urged him to issue a public apology, something brief, even symbolic. Others argued that apologizing would make him look weak. The president's son-in-law, seated quietly near the window, finally said the real issue isn't legal, it's moral. People saw the tape, they made up their minds. Trump glared at him. You sound like them. That night in the private dining room adjacent to the Oval Office, Trump met with two loyal confidants. The TV in the corner played muted coverage of Obama speaking at a youth leadership summit. The headline read, Obama focuses on respect and responsibility amid ongoing legal battle. Trump gestured toward the screen. Look at him acting like a saint. He's milking this for attention. His confidant, a longtime political strategist, leaned forward. You're fighting on his turf. Now you can't outclass him. You have to outplay him. Trump narrowed his eyes. What are you suggesting? Go on offense. Question the lawsuit's legitimacy. Make it about power, not respect. Trump nodded slowly. Power, that's what people understand. The next morning he tweeted again, this time targeting Obama's lawyer directly, another witch hunt. Obama's team is full of corrupt lawyers who hate America. The post went viral instantly within hours. Reeves's office received dozens of threatening calls. Meanwhile, Barack Obama's response remained steady. When asked by a journalist, Whether he'd seen Trump's latest comments, he simply said, "We're not reacting to noise. We're focused on truth." That quiet dignity made headlines of its own inside the White House. Aides grew anxious. Approval ratings slipped. Key donors began calling campaign staff worried about long-term damage. Even some members of Trump's party started to distance themselves. One senator told reporters, "We all believe in free speech, but there's a line between opinion and humiliation." Trump watched that clip replayed on TV and threw the remote against the couch traitors. Every one of them. Later that week, an emergency meeting was called in the Situation Room. Not about foreign policy, but about image control. Laura Pierce presented polling data showing that 68% of Americans thought the president's remarks were inappropriate. Trump refused to believe it. Fake numbers. They've always been fake. Laura tried one last time. "Sir, we can still change the story if you issue an apology. Now just one sentence, it could de-escalate." He stared at her for several long seconds, then leaned forward. "I don't apologize ever. It makes you small." The room fell silent again after the meeting. Laura packed her files quietly, knowing her time there was nearing its end. Staff turnover had become routine, but this felt different. It felt like watching the walls close. In that same night, a leaked memo surfaced online, an internal White House document outlining possible financial exposure. If the court refused to dismiss the case, the memo suggested the president might personally owe hundreds of millions in damages. It spread across social media in minutes. Cable networks ran it. Nonstop commentators debated whether it was real or planted. But one thing was certain. The chaos inside the White House was no longer hidden. Trump stayed up late watching coverage alone. The TV flickered across his face as pundits speculated about his mental state. Somewhere between the static and the silence, he muttered, "They think they can beat me with words." But while he was losing control behind those walls outside, the nation was beginning to take sides. And the reaction would turn the lawsuit into something far bigger than anyone expected. By the third week, the story had escaped Washington and embedded itself into everyday American life. You couldn't walk into a cafe, a barber shop, or a grocery store without hearing someone mention it. It wasn't just a political scandal anymore. It was a question of decency. Cable networks filled their schedules with endless debates. Every talk show had a panel of experts, and every one of them spoke with certainty about what this meant for the country. Some called Obama's lawsuit a bold stand for respect. Others called it a dangerous precedent. But regardless of their opinions, no one could deny one thing: the country was watching. In Los Angeles, people gathered at a park where volunteers projected the infamous town hall clip onto a large outdoor screen. Some booed, others shouted. But when Trump's mocking tone filled the air, an older woman stood up and said loudly, "That's someone's wife he's talking about." The crowd went quiet for a moment. Then applause broke out across the country. In Cleveland, a group of law students streamed the news coverage inside a university auditorium. One of them, a young woman named Rachel Bynes, whispered to her friend, "This case could change everything we're learning in class if Obama wins it." "Redefines free speech limits for public officials," her professor nodded, overhearing her. "It's more than that," he said. "It redefines respect in politics." Meanwhile, outside the courthouse in Washington, crowds grew larger every day. Some held posters that read "Truth Matters" and "Respect Michelle." Others carried signs that said, "Stop the witch hunt." Police had to extend barricades as tensions rose between groups, shouting across the street at each other. News crews set up permanent tents near the courthouse steps. Each morning, reporters stood in front of live cameras, narrating every development. One reporter said, "This is no longer a lawsuit. It's a mirror reflecting America's divisions inside the Obama home." Michelle watched the coverage. Quietly, her daughters called, often asking how she was holding up. "I'm fine," she always said. But Barack knew the weight she was carrying. One night, as they sat together on the back porch, she finally spoke her truth. "You know, Barack," she said softly, "when you live your life trying to do right by people and someone tears that down just to get applause, it's not the insult that hurts. It's the noise afterward. The strangers who feel like they have a right to weigh in on who you are." He reached over, placing a hand on hers. "The noise doesn't define you," he said. "What we do next does." That same week, Michelle made her first public appearance since the lawsuit began. It was at a literacy event for children in Philadelphia. something she had scheduled months ago. Reporters surrounded the entrance, hoping for a statement as she walked past them. Someone called out, "Mrs. Obama, do you have anything to say about the president's comments?" She paused, turned slightly, and said with quiet confidence, "I've spent my life believing that words matter, and I still do." Then she walked inside. That 8-second clip flooded every social platform within an hour. People quoted it, shared it, and even printed it on T-shirts. It became a rallying cry for those who felt exhausted by years of verbal attacks and division in the White House. Trump's team monitored the shift in public sentiment. One advisor showed him a poll that said 72% of Americans believed his comments were offensive and unnecessary. Trump refused to accept it. Fake numbers, he said, tossing the paper aside. But his aides saw the reality. He wouldn't admit the tide was turning conservative. Media hosts began softening their tones, suddenly trying to distance themselves. Look, one anchor said on a primetime show, maybe the comment was harsh, maybe it crossed the line, but an $800 million lawsuit, come on. Even that half defense couldn't save the narrative. Clips of the insult were still circulating, played alongside Michelle's quiet statement. The contrast was undeniable, one man yelling for attention and one woman speaking with grace. Meanwhile, rallies spread to other cities. Detroit, Minneapolis, Tampa, Seattle protesters carried photos of Michelle with signs that read, "Dignity over division." Choir groups sang in the background, while volunteers handed out candles. These weren't political rallies. They felt more like vigils, moments of reflection in a country desperate for calm. That weekend, the Obamas attended church in D.C. Cameras caught them entering the building. Hand in hand inside, the pastor addressed the congregation. "When someone chooses cruelty, we must choose character. That's how you win without losing your soul." The audience stood in applause. Barack bowed his head, his hands still clasped in Michelle's back at the White House. Trump watched clips of that sermon replayed on the morning shows. His expression hardened. "They're turning this into a movie," he muttered. His chief of staff, standing by the door, hesitated before saying, "Sir, they're turning it into a moment." Trump didn't respond over the next few days. Donations to the Obama Foundation skyrocketed. Book sales of Becoming and A Promised Land surged again. Michelle's words were quoted by celebrities, teachers, and even corporate leaders. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about respect, and the public had chosen its side. Late one night, Barack received a call from Reeves, his lawyer. The judge denied the motion to dismiss. Reeves said, "We're going to trial." Barack exhaled slowly. "Then it's time," he said. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the windows. Michelle looked up from her book. "What did he say?" Barack smiled faintly. He said, "We're not done yet." But as the court prepared for the first hearing, both sides knew this wouldn't just be a legal battle. It would be a fight for moral ground in front of the entire nation. The first day of the trial felt like history being written in real time. Outside, the courthouse streets were blocked off. Camera cranes swung above the crowds, and security was tighter than anyone could remember. Reporters compared the atmosphere to Watergate. But this time, the tension wasn't about corruption. It was about respect, dignity, and the power of words. Inside courtroom 3B of the U.S. District Court in Washington, the air was still and cold. Every seat was filled. Senators, journalists, legal scholars, and everyday citizens who had lined up since dawn for a chance to witness it. Barack Obama sat quietly beside his attorney, Jonathan Reeves. Michelle wasn't in the room that morning, but her presence was everywhere. Photographs of her lined the protest signs outside, and her name was mentioned with reverence in nearly every conversation. Then the heavy wooden doors opened, and President Trump walked in, his legal team trailing behind him. He didn't look at Obama, not once. He kept his eyes fixed ahead as he took his seat at the defendant's table. Cameras were banned from inside, but sketches and whispered notes would soon flood every major outlet. The judge, Eleanor Sykes, entered, moments later, known for her firm tone and unflinching neutrality. She surveyed the room before speaking. "This court will hear arguments regarding Obama versus Trump, case number 24 CV 1983. Both parties will conduct themselves with decorum. Let's begin." Reeves rose first. His voice was calm but steady, the kind of tone that made people lean in. "Your Honor, this case is not about politics. It's about harm. It's about a sitting president using the most powerful platform in the world to humiliate another citizen, someone who has given decades of service to this nation. This is about accountability. He then played a clip from the town hall on a monitor. The sound of Trump's laughter filled the courtroom. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably when the clip ended. Reeves looked at the judge. Those words weren't policy. They weren't humor. They were meant to demean. And under our laws, no one, no matter how powerful, is above the consequences of that. Trump's lead attorney, Bill Sanderson, stood next. His tone was defiant. Your Honor, the president has the right to express opinions. This is a textbook case of free speech. It may be controversial, it may be blunt, but it's protected. If we start punishing public figures for every strong statement, we'll erase the foundation of open discourse. Judge Sykes nodded slowly, noted proceed with witnesses. Reeves called his first doctor, Allison Mendez, a media ethics professor from Georgetown. She explained how the power imbalance between a sitting president and a private citizen amplifies harm when millions of people hear those words from the highest office they take on weight. She said they echo in ways ordinary speech does not. The defense tried to shake her, asking whether satire and criticism weren't integral to democracy. Yes, she replied, but ridicule rooted in personal attack isn't critique, it's character destruction. Trump shifted in his chair, whispering something to his lawyer. Next came Marcus Layton, a former White House speechwriter who testified that he'd been in the room when Trump prepared for the town hall. He was told multiple times to avoid personal remarks. Layton said he ignored that advice. Reeves looked directly at the jury, so it was intentional. Layton hesitated, then nodded. Yes, the room stirred when it was the defense's turn. They called Clara Dunn, a communications strategist who had worked on several campaigns. She argued that political speech was always emotional. You can't separate the man from the message, she said. Voters expect blunt honesty. Reeves rose for cross-examination. Honesty, he said, pacing slowly, isn't cruelty, would you say, calling a woman angry or mocking? Her appearance qualifies as honest commentary. Dunn faltered. It depends on context. Reeves leaned in slightly, and what context justifies public humiliation? The courtroom went silent by the end of the third day. Both sides had clashed. Trump's defense built their argument around constitutional protection, while Reeves hammered on intent, and moral duty. Reporters outside described the exchanges as icy and electric. During a recess, Trump and Obama crossed paths in the hallway for the first time since the case began. Cameras weren't allowed there, but several witnesses later described the moment Trump, flanked by Secret Service, stopped. Briefly, Obama met his gaze. Trump smirked. You think this makes you noble? Obama didn't flinch. No, he said evenly, it just makes me responsible. They passed each other without another word that night. Talk shows replayed accounts of that brief exchange as if it were a movie scene. Analysts debated who looked stronger. But the next morning, Reeves delivered a closing argument that no one would forget. Words have power. He said, his voice firm, they build or they break. They can lift a child's spirit or crush it. They can unite a country or divide it beyond repair. The presidency magnifies that power 1,000-fold when that power is used carelessly. It's not leadership, it's harm. And today, this court has a chance to draw a line between the two. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Judge Sykes took a pause before thanking him. The defense gave their rebuttal, fiery and combative, but the mood had shifted for the first time. It felt like Trump's bravado couldn't overpower the gravity of what had been said. After court adjourned, Obama stepped outside to a crowd of hundreds chanting Michelle's name. He waved, briefly said nothing, and got into the car inside. Reeves turned to him. Whatever happens, he said, you already want something bigger than money. Obama looked out the window at the people holding signs. We'll see. He said quietly, the truth has a way of catching up, but no one, not even the most seasoned analyst, was prepared for what the judge would declare next. The verdict would shock the nation and change the way power spoke forever. The morning of the verdict felt heavier than any day before. Lines formed outside the courthouse. Before sunrise, reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the doors to open. There was no laughter in the crowd this time, just tension. People clutched coffee cups, phones, and folded newspapers, whispering predictions. They couldn't quite believe inside courtroom 3B. The air was sharp and cold. Barack Obama sat still, hands clasped in front of him, eyes focused on the bench across the aisle. Trump leaned back in his chair, jaw tight, whispering to his lawyer. His expression was unreadable, half confident, half cornered. When Judge Eleanor Sykes entered, everyone rose. Her face gave nothing away. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and began this case. She said slowly has tested boundaries that have long been assumed but never formally defined. We have weighed free speech against deliberate harm, authority against accountability, and power against respect. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratching of pens. The evidence shows she continued that the remarks made by President Trump during the televised event were not part of his official duties. They were personal in nature and intentionally degrading. Therefore, the claim of presidential immunity does not apply. Trump's head jerked up, his lawyer whispered urgently, "She's still speaking." Judge Sykes went on the court fines in favor of the plaintiff, President Barack Obama, and awards damages in the amount of $800 million. A collective gasp filled the room. Even the court stenographer paused for a moment. Reporters scrambled for their phones outside. The crowd erupted, some cheering, some booing all. Shouting the verdict spread across the world within minutes. Trump's face flushed deep red. "This is a joke," he shouted, slamming his hand against the table. The judge rapped her gavel. "Mr. President, you are out of order. Control yourself." But he kept going, muttering under his breath about bias, corruption, witch hunts. His lawyer tried to calm him, whispering, "We'll appeal. We'll file immediately." Obama stayed seated still and calm the way he had throughout the trial. He leaned toward Reeves and said quietly, "Let's go." The two men stood, shook hands, and walked toward the exit as the courtroom descended into noise outside. It was chaos. Supporters flooded the steps, chanting Michelle's name again, and waving signs that read accountability. Others shouted back, angry and defiant. Police formed lines to keep them separated. Cameras followed every move, every expression. Obama paused briefly at the top of the courthouse steps, surrounded by security and staff. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply said this wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. "I hope we can all remember that moving forward." Then he turned and left inside the White House. Trump's reaction was volcanic. The footage of his outburst during a staff meeting leaked within hours. "They want to ruin me," he yelled, slamming a folder on the table. "They can't take a joke anymore. Everyone's too sensitive." Laura Pierce, his former communications director, who had quietly returned to help contain the crisis, stood by the doorway. "Sir, this isn't about a joke. It's about accountability. You've got to show restraint." He turned toward her, pointing a finger. "Restraint doesn't win elections. Laura Power does." But the damage was already spreading. Major news networks replayed the verdict in slow motion, accompanied by analysis and heated commentary. One headline read, "A historic ruling, no one is above words." Another said the cost of disrespect, $800 million. Public opinion shifted almost overnight. Polls showed that even some of Trump's base had begun questioning his behavior. Legal experts debated whether the judgment would ever be paid, but the symbolism mattered more than the number in Chicago. The Obama spent the evening at home away from cameras. Michelle sat beside Barack, scrolling through messages from friends and strangers alike, teachers, mothers, veterans, even Republicans who wrote to say they supported what she stood for. She looked up from her phone. "Do you feel like we actually won?" she asked. Barack took a breath. "We didn't win," he said softly. "We reminded people that words have weight." He turned on the television coverage of protests and celebrations, filled every channel. Some people sang outside the courthouse. Others burned signs in anger. It was a portrait of a divided country, yet something underneath felt different, like a long overdue confrontation had finally begun. Meanwhile, Trump's lawyers held a press conference late that night. Sanderson stood at the podium, his tone rehearsed. "We will appeal this verdict immediately. The president maintains his full innocence and stands by his right to free expression." A reporter asked, "Does the president plan to apologize to Mrs. Obama?" Sanderson hesitated, then replied, "At this time, no." The room buzzed with murmurs over the next several days. The markets wobbled, late-night comedians had a field-day talk shows, couldn't decide whether this was justice or politics. But something deeper was shifting. Teachers began using the case in classrooms. Law students wrote essays about accountability. Pastors spoke about humility one Sunday morning during a community event in Dallas, the same city where it all began. A YOASH group of volunteers painted a mural. It showed Michelle Obama's face above the words, "Respect is strength." Cameras captured it as Barack quietly walked by, hands in his pockets. Observing the finished wall, a local journalist asked him, "Do you think this changes anything?" He smiled faintly. "Change doesn't happen all at once," he said. "But it starts when people decide that silence isn't an option anymore." The clip went viral again, but this time it wasn't outrage that fueled it. It was admiration for a brief moment amid the shouting and headlines. The country seemed to remember something it had forgotten. Dignity still mattered. But while the dust was settling, one last question lingered in everyone's mind. What happens after respect is restored, but trust is gone? The verdict had been read, the cameras had moved on, and yet the story lingered. It lived in dinner table conversations, on morning talk shows, in classrooms, and across the infinite scroll of social media. America was still talking not about money, not about politics, but about respect. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in tone across the country. The lawsuit had become a symbol, and people began asking themselves questions they hadn't before. How far is too far? When words come from power? When does humor become cruelty? And what does it say about us when we cheer for it? Barack and Michelle stayed mostly out of the spotlight. They retreated to their Chicago home, avoiding interviews and appearances. But they couldn't avoid the impact donations to education and civility programs skyrocketed. Universities organized symposia on speech and responsibility. Even some of Trump's critics, those who had grown numb to his antics, admitted that for the first time they'd seen a consequence actually stick. One chilly morning in early March, Barack sat in his home office reading a letter that had arrived from a high school student in Tulsa. It was written in shaky handwriting on lined notebook paper. "Mr. Obama," it began, "I saw what you did for your wife. My mom told me no one stands up for people anymore. But you did. I just wanted to say, thank you." He folded the note carefully and slipped it into a drawer beside his presidential pen. Set when Michelle entered a few minutes later, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, he handed it to her. She read it slowly and smiled. "You think that kid knows he just made my day?" He chuckled softly. "Probably not, but that's the beauty of doing the right thing. You never know who's watching outside the political world." The aftershocks continued. Several news organizations announced stricter standards for televised debates. Social media platforms quietly introduced new guidelines on defamation. Public figures, once proud of saying whatever comes to mind, suddenly spoke with more caution. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. But inside the White House, the air was different. The corridors that once pulsed with noise now carried a constant tension. Trump's advisors were split between those urging him to appeal the decision and those begging him to move on. The appeal was filed within a week, but few believed it would overturn the ruling behind closed doors. Frustration grew late one night. Trump sat alone in the Oval Office, the glow of the television washing over his face. A commentator was replaying a montage of the trial's most powerful moments, including Obama's quiet line from the courthouse steps. This wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. The camera lingered on that image for a moment longer than necessary. Trump leaned back in his chair, muttering to himself, "They'll forget in a month." But deep down, even he knew this. One wouldn't fade like the others. A few days later, Obama gave his first and only post-trial interview on PBS. The host asked him, was this ever about winning? He paused for a long moment before answering. "No, winning is temporary. What lasts is how we treat each other." This was about setting a standard, not just for me or Michelle, but for anyone who's been publicly humiliated and told to just take it. The host nodded, then asked, "Do you think it changed him?" Obama smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but I hope it changed someone." Watching the interview became one of the most replayed clips of the year, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt human, quiet, honest, and steady. In the months that followed, political commentators began referring to the case simply as Obama versus Trump. The way people reference Brown v. Board or Roe v. Wade, it had become a legal landmark, not just about law, but about culture. Students wrote essays about it. Professors debated it. Parents used it to teach their children that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean shouting louder. Sometimes it means holding your ground in silence, until truth speaks for you. In late summer, Barack and Michelle attended a community fundraiser in Detroit. The event was for literacy programs, but the energy felt more like gratitude when Barack took the stage. He didn't speak long. "There's a reason we teach our children to think before they speak," he said, "because once words are out, you can't take them back. They travel faster than we do. They shape what others believe about us and what we believe about ourselves. That's why we have to guard them carefully." He paused, looking out at the audience. "We can disagree on policies, on taxes, on almost everything. But if we lose respect, we lose the foundation of democracy itself." The audience rose to its feet in applause. Some cried. Some simply nodded their faces, solemn as if the words had reached somewhere deeper than politics. Later that night, as they drove back to their hotel, Michelle stared out the window at the passing lights. "You think people will remember this in 10 years?" she asked. Barack smiled. "Maybe not the headlines, but they'll remember how it made them feel." Silence filled the car for a moment before Michelle said, "Then it was worth it." He reached for her hand always by the time they arrived at the hotel. The streets were quiet. The noise had faded, but the message had not. Across the country, from classrooms to courtrooms, people were still talking. Not about who won or lost, but about what it means to speak with decency in a world that rewards outrage. In the end, it wasn't the money, the verdict, or even the headlines that defined the story. It was the reminder that words matter, that no title, no office, and no power can erase the responsibility that comes with using them. Respect isn't weakness, it's the strongest language we have left. And if you followed this far, take a second to think about that, because maybe it's time we all start speaking with purpose again. Subscribe for more stories that remind us why the truth still matters.